we're recording this, so off we go.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's always good to see the 1904 World's Fair Society. You've been good friends to us for so long here at the History Museum. And I'm not going to speak long at all, but we've got a wonderful presentation by our public historian, Adam Kloppe, today, all about the new exhibit that will be opening next spring, because we are getting ready to close the current exhibit on April 30th. I think you all had a chance to pick up a flyer at the table when you came in about sort of what's going on here. And of course, World's Fair Society is back here on the closing day, which would have been the opening day of the World's Fair, April 30th. So we're really excited about that. Before Adam gives his presentation, I'd like to introduce a new member of Missouri Historical Society. Since Dr. Jody Sowell took the president position, we recently filled his former position. So Sam Moore is here with us. He's been here for about a month now, and he's our managing director of public history.
Excellent. Hey, all, good morning. Thanks for having me this morning. I am very excited to be here. You cannot have a conversation about the 1904 World's Fair and a new exhibit about the 1904 World's Fair without the World's Fair Society, of course. So a pleasure to be here. Oh, there you go. Okay. A pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm really looking forward to working with you all, not just over the next year, but in the years to come, right? This is a core St. Louis story for us here at the Missouri History Museum. It's one we've told for 20 years in our current show. It's one we'll tell for the next several years. I'm not going to commit to 20 for this particular gallery, but it's a story that is always going to be kind of part of our fabric here in St. Louis and in the place that, our day-to-day jobs are to talk about St. Louis's history. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm not going to speak for long, but I did want to give you a little bit of background on me. So we'll be spending a lot of time together. Oh, I'm on this camera. Yeah. Hello. Because we'll be spending a lot of time together here over the next several years, and also a little preview of what's coming, some of which you've probably heard about. My background is in museums. My background in particular is focused on the people parts of museums. So working with great community partners like you all, working with our visitors, working with the fascinating people who choose to work in museums. And so working on programming and exhibits. This is my second stint with the Missouri Historical Society. I was previously here from 2015 to 2018 working in a communications role. If you follow us on Facebook, that was my channel to grow back several years ago. I also worked with the Campbell House Museum here in St. Louis. If you're familiar, I was assistant director there. I've got two favorite museums in St. Louis. Campbell House and MHM are tied for that #1 spot. For the past 5 years, I have not been in St. Louis. I am from here, but for the past 5 years, I've been in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I worked with the Senator John Hines History Center in Pittsburgh, which is really kind of our peer museum out in Western Pennsylvania, focused on all the fascinating stories that Pittsburgh has to tell, from Mr. Rogers to Heinz Ketchup, to the Apollo missions, to labor and steel and industry. I also worked at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, which is not a history museum and is America's largest indoor bird zoo. There's a lot more living things and a lot more poop, I like to say, in that job than in any job I've had before or since. And for the past couple of years, I've been building a museum from the ground up. So in October of this past year, we opened the Moonshot Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is Pennsylvania's first space museum and the first museum in the world focused on career readiness for the 21st century space industry. Again, not focused on history, but focused on building a small nonprofit and small museum from the ground up. I'm here after 5 years in a city that I come to love. My husband and I both come to love in Pittsburgh. There really is only one place and only one city that could bring us back from Pittsburgh, and it's the Missouri Historical Society, and it's St. Louis, Missouri. We are really thrilled to be home. We are really thrilled to be here, and I am particularly thrilled to be working here at such an exciting moment. World's Fair opens almost exactly a year from now. This show that has meant a lot to me personally, and I know a lot to all of you over the course of the past 2 decades, closes in a month's time. We're at a really exciting moment. And then it's followed by new signature galleries like our Collected exhibition, which opens in 25, our Gallery STL dual exhibition on the 2nd floor, which we all know needs a little bit of love and renewal. It's going to get a lot of love and a lot of renewal when it opens in 2027. And so there are big things on the horizon here. It's a big moment. And as we think about the Missouri Historical Society that shares St. Louis history boldly and broadly, and as the place where we have those meaningful conversations that make a difference for St. Louis and St. Louisans, I'm really excited to be working with all you to get that done. So with that, I'm done talking because Emily and Adam have incredible things to show you, but I actually think I'm introducing Mike. So you all know Mike. Mike.
Okay, well, hopefully I'm framed right. We have a guy looking at us here to make sure things are right. I want to thank Emily and Sam and the History Museum for hosting us today as kind of a joint meeting. We're here, but they've not invited everyone because they have more things that they want to do for the general public and for their members. And we went, okay, and I'm totally pleased that just on the membership of the World's Fair Society that we had so many people turn out for this, especially I know we'd have another 15 people or so or more if it was an evening meeting and all those people that are still working would be here, but that didn't quite work out right. So I want to welcome you all to the March 2023 meeting of the 1904 World's Fair Society. I think most of you know I'm Mike Truax. I want to welcome you, and this year marks the, if you haven't heard this before, the 119th anniversary of the World's Fair and the 37th year of the 1904 World's Fair Society. Today, you've heard about the presentation we're going to get. Adam Kloppe, the public historian, is going to tell us about what's going to happen here over the next year and a half. I just want to ask real quickly, are there any new members or non-society members here today that are coming with somebody? Okay, want to welcome you. When we're done, I want all the members to pounce on those people and say, you need to join. On the table as you came in, if you've been a member for a while, you know about our handouts. One is about the World's Fair Society. I'll put that in front of the camera. One's about the World's Fair. The invitation to join is all about the World's Fair Society. And we're running out of these, but we're going to get these reprinted for the next meeting, all about the Ferris wheel. The unblemished facts that have been researched, sometimes painfully. Please feel free to take handouts that are back there, and we'll have an attendance prize drawing. We have a copy of the Laura Merritt book At the Fair that Margie Kent finally got published. And how many people have a copy of that already? Okay, so good. Only about a third of you. So hopefully everybody put their name on a piece of paper, and we'll do a drawing at the end. Adam will get to draw names until he gets it right and find someone who hasn't bought the book yet, because we also have some names from last month here. Administrative reminders, please be sure and mute your cell phones since we're recording this so that you don't hear telephones ringing during the presentation. I'd like to set the stage real briefly with a look back at what happened 119 years ago today. On Wednesday, March 16th, 1904, the opening of the fair was just 6 weeks away. There was a lot of work to be done. And while you have been out to the fair, people went out to the fairgrounds to walk around on Sunday when construction wasn't going on, and they could see all the work that was being done. There was still a whole lot of work to be done. And they were about to cut off the Sunday visits because they were going to go to, I think, 7 days a week, try to get everything they could done. The Brazilian aviator, Alberto Santos Dumont, came to St. Louis, and he met with William Smith, the chief of the LPE's transportation exhibits. Santos Dumont gained fame in 1901 when he flew a dirigible airship around the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And he wanted to win the $100,000 grand prize at the 1904 World's Fair, which was to fly about 20 miles on an L-shaped course and take off where you, or land where you took off from. He recommended several changes to the requirements, which were accepted. And Smith agreed to change them to limit it to 10 miles, and reduce the average speed requirement for the course from 20 miles an hour to 18.5 miles an hour. Why 18.5? 30 kilometers per hour metric. The LPCE concessions department agreed to let Kodakers, who knows what a Kodaker is? Oh, 4 or 5 people, to take snapshots at the fair without paying an additional fee. They were going to charge anyone with a camera an extra fee to come in and take pictures. But Kodak was building a building and they were going to rent their cameras out to fairgoers and take small album shots, 4 by 5 inches. And so they got them to change the rules and not charge an extra fee. But if you were coming in with a bigger camera that required a tripod, that would require a permit and that would require a fee payment to take pictures. And finally, King Gabadabo was the ruler of the African kingdom of Yambaland. That was in Central Africa back in 1904, with 115 million people. He said he would come to the World's Fair if he was given certain assurances. He wanted to be entertained in regal fashion, befitting a king, and he wanted a specially worded invitation to be in terms befitting a royal personage. I don't know if that ever got written, but I have never read about King Badabo from Africa coming to the fair. And so now moving on to, before I move on and introduce Adam, we are recording this. I also want to let some of our regular photographers know to please talk with me afterwards, and I'll send an email to you with email addresses that Doug is going to try to assemble the many pictures that I will take and that I know Shara will take and maybe Ange will take, and ask those people that are kind of our regular photographers to send all the pictures to myself, Jana Meehan, who's our bulletin editor, and she likes to get 3 or 4 or more pictures of a meeting. And if it's the banquet or picnic, she wants a whole bunch to put in the bulletin, which is kind of nice to see what went on last month. And also to Doug, who's going to try to assemble and pick the best dozen or so pictures for my year in review, and also for the website, so that we can start putting pictures, regularly back out on the website of the presenters, their program, and the people that come to our meetings. So does anybody have any questions or things that I need to mention before the meeting? After the presentation, I will go ask that question again, and I will talk about the upcoming meetings. But I want to recognize Walter Gotch, who raised his hand. He has something he wants to pass on to everybody. Could there be a photo op of members? Well, basically, almost everybody's a member here. And if you want a picture, I'm sure our photographers will sneak around the sides and take a picture of the crowd here. But if you have a camera that you want to take it on, nope. Okay. Okay, on to today's presentation. Adam Kloppe graduated from Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and I didn't know till I looked that up, with a double major in English and sociology. He completed his master's in American Studies in 2010 at St. Louis University, and then completed a doctoral degree. He is a research fellow and public historian at the History Museum, where he has a historical society, pardon me. There is a slight difference. We are in the building of the History Museum. The Historical Society encompasses not just the History Museum, but also the Library and Research Center. And how many people know that they also now control the Soldiers and Sailors Monument downtown? If you haven't been there, that's a pretty neat thing to go see, by the way. So here he has contributed to and served as content leads for special exhibits, such as about 8 or 9 years ago, the Louisiana Purchase exhibit and Panoramas of St. Louis more recently. And for the last couple of years, stretched out over COVID, he's been working hard on the designs and planning and the contract requirements of the new World's Fair exhibit, And now it's about to happen, and I'll bet he thinks he's going to be able to relax once its construction starts. Probably not.
I know you're wrong about that, Mike.
Well, I'll give you Adam Kloppe to tell you about all the fun he's been having.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out. You know, it means I'm a historian, and it means so much to me to see a group of people coming out to learn about history. We get told all the time that history is that boring subject in high school that nobody ever wants to take. And I have never agreed with that. I think history is so incredibly exciting. And it just fills my heart with joy to see a room of people who also agree with me. So thank you so much for being here. As Mike mentioned, we've been hard at work here at the Missouri Historical Society for several years on a brand new World's Fair exhibit. It's scheduled to open in 2024. As Mike mentioned, the exhibit that's been up there now is scheduled to close in about a month. And so, you know, we've been hard at work for a long time. Myself, our curator, Sharon Smith, who couldn't be here today. Many of you know her, and our incredible designer, Emily Clark, who's here. She's sitting in the back row back there. And if you have questions about the design things that I certainly can't answer, she knows all of that stuff, and she's so tremendous, and she's done such a great job on this show. But what I'm going to do today is introduce you guys a little bit to the new exhibit that we're putting together. It's scheduled to open next year. I think it's incredibly exciting. I think we have some just amazing plans for it, and I can't wait for you all to see it. But before I start sharing those plans too much, I want to take just a second to pay some tribute to the exhibit that served us so well for 20 years, right? The exhibit that's up there, looking back at looking forward. And so we're going to look back at looking forward here for just a few minutes. It got a laugh. Someone told me that wouldn't get a laugh. I'm so glad. So this exhibit opened in 2004. And, you know, I wasn't here in 2004, so I wanted to know, when I was thinking about this, what kind of reception did this exhibit get when it opened? I know that I think that exhibit up there is great today, even if, you know, there's some things that need updating, some artifacts that need to rest. But what was the reception in 2004? Well, I went and looked up some newspaper coverage of the event, and I have some quotes here. And, you know, honestly, you know, a lot of times when these articles are talking about the exhibit, they're wrapping it into all the celebrations of the World's Fair that were happening in 2004. The celebration on Art Hill that I know the World's Fair Society was instrumental in putting together, a new exhibit at the Art Museum, other events that were happening around town. But here's some quotes that I pulled just about the exhibit here as it opened. So on the left, that picture over there of the woman holding the bird, that was a review of the exhibit that's also published in conjunction with a review of an exhibit that was at the Art Museum about art at the 1904 World's Fair. And it's sort of comparing the two exhibits. And here's what they had to say about the History Museum's exhibit. The History Museum's exhibition is the more ambitious of the two. With 250 artifacts and objects, it is an exhaustive but not exhausting look at the fair. Filling a two-story gallery, it is spaciously installed. By not trying to do too much, it achieves its goal. It features real objects, and where reproductions are used, it is clearly noted. There's no hokey films of recreated events that took place without the benefit of having been filmed at the time. The film of the fair that it shows, jerky and primitive of it is, was filmed at the fair, and it's exciting because it's real. So, praising the exhibit for showing the fair as it actually was. That was a note we got in 2004. Another one from the top center of that woman sort of looking into the stereograph there. It says this exhibit helps people because in 2004, quote, personal accounts of the fair have become faded family lore and descendants of fairgoers struggle to remember their stories. So in 2004, there's people struggling to try to keep the memory of the fair alive. We're almost 20 years after that. We have to do a little bit more to keep that memory of the fair alive than maybe we did in 2004, right? In the bottom center there, which is about all the events that happened around, you know, the anniversary in 2004. Sharon Smith is quoted as saying, any city looks at the moments that define its character, and the World's Fair was certainly a defining moment when the world was looking to St. Louis. So honoring some of the same things about the fair that we still honor today, when the world is looking to St. Louis in 1904 and how that still matters for our city. And then finally, on the right over here, the image with the statue and the desk, that review said, the curators of a new Missouri History Museum exhibit marking the centennial of the 1904 World's Fair, had a daunting challenge: to compress the story of a 7-month event that attracted nearly 20 million visitors and took years to plan and construct into a concise and yet encompassing informational display. They have managed to cram into the space they have lots and lots of artifacts and interactive displays that will appeal to all age groups. And I can certainly sympathize with the struggle of trying to tell the story of a 7-month event that encompasses so much history and so many incredible moments into a fairly small display. But that's what the newspapers are saying in 2004. You can tell people were really excited about this exhibit. But did that last? Well, let's find out. I went through and tried to find some numbers of people who have visited the exhibit over the years. I couldn't find all of them. They're kind of spread among different places. We have them all. I just couldn't get them all in time. But I wanted to share some of those moments with you. In 2005 and 2006, the exhibit averaged almost 150,000 visitors a year. That's a lot of people. By 2010, the exhibit had been seen by almost 600,000 people. So in its first 6 years, almost 600,000 people went through that exhibit up there and took away thoughts and memories about the World's Fair that are presented in that exhibit. But that's the first 6 years. Did it last? I think it did. The next batch of numbers I had were from 2015 to 2019. You can see there, in 2019, over 130,000 people were still coming out every year to visit the World's Fair exhibit. That's pretty incredible. 130,000 people every year said they wanted to learn something about the history of the World's Fair in St. Louis. You can tell right there, there's one date that has an asterisk next to it, 2018. And that's also the lowest attendance of any of the 5 years in there. The asterisk is there just to remind me to tell you. So I got these numbers on a chart that charted the attendance for all of our core galleries that we have. World's Fair and then Currents and Reflections, the 2 galleries upstairs. 2018 was the only year in the span of 5 years that either Currents or Reflections beat World's Fair in attendance. World's Fair is still one of the most popular exhibits we have on the history of St. Louis. Then we get into the COVID years. Attendance has gone down a little bit because we weren't open as much, right? And you can tell that 2020, under 50,000 visitors. But you can see by 2022, those numbers are ticked back up. 80,000 people came through to see World's Fair in 2022. And in 2023, through March 8th, over 16,000 people this year alone had already been in to learn about World's Fair. That's incredible. If you total up just the numbers I showed you right there, that's over 1 million people have come through the doors to learn about World's Fair specifically in the 20 years since this exhibit has been open. But does attendance tell us everything? It might not. Do people still love the World's Fair exhibit? I went to TripAdvisor to find out. I just looked up the History Museum and I pulled some quotes about people who love the World's Fair. And I had to be pretty selective because almost every review, positive or negative, about the History Museum has a note in there about, I did love that World's Fair exhibit. If they hated everything else, they loved World's Fair. If they loved everything else, they loved World's Fair. You can see here, the 1904 World's Fair exhibit is very informative and has lots of cool artifacts. I really enjoyed learning about the fair and even purchased a souvenir. This is an excellent first stop if you're interested in learning about Missouri and St. Louis. The 1904 World's Fair exhibition is especially insightful for understanding the significance of St. Louis and the US on the world stage. I really enjoyed seeing artifacts from the World's Fair. That was a cool exhibit. That's from 2018. The exhibit is 14 years old by the time that comes out. People are still saying, that's cool. They're not thinking of it as something that is old history or something. They think it's cool and relevant. I never get tired of the World's Fair exhibit. I think the World's Fair exhibit is the best. These are still the kinds of reviews we get for that exhibit up there. And my favorite review, I hope my volume is up. Please have the volume be up. Is this. Is the volume up? No. Oh no, it's not showing up there. I am so sorry. Anyway, I will give up on that. It is that was a review from a kid curator who came through, who, looked at our exhibit. She's interested in going into the museum field and talked about all the wonderful things she saw in the World's Fair exhibit. Her big note is that she wishes the dresses were sparklier, which, I tend to agree. I wish they were sparklier. But, you can tell there's still a lot of excitement for the World's Fair exhibit we have up there. There's still a lot of excitement in St. Louis for the World's Fair, as so many of you guys coming out on a Thursday morning can demonstrate to us. But we need to start looking ahead from our exhibit, looking back at looking forward, right? This exhibit closes in April of 2023, and there's going to be a lot of chances to celebrate this exhibit in the next month or so. The weekend before it closes, we're going to have several events here, really talking about the exhibit and what it's meant to so many people. I think we're going to have a screening. We're planning on having a screening of Meet Me in St. Louis one night too. We want to really send off the exhibit with a bang here, because it's informed hundreds of thousands of visitors and thousands of school groups about the importance of the 1904 World's Fair. And every single person in this room, I'm sure, has fond memories of things in that exhibit. You remember the people you brought who got excited by the fair by showing them the things that are in that exhibit. You might remember getting into the fair yourself because of something you saw up there. It's a great show. It's also had a really long run, and it deserves a time to rest. The things that are in there deserve a time to rest. We don't think of sitting in an exhibit as a particularly stressful thing, but for our artifacts, that is an incredibly stressful thing. There's lights on it. There's hundreds of people walking by every day and creating vibrations as they walk. We need to protect those artifacts. We need to protect those stories about the fair so they can still be there for future generations. So it's time, really, to say goodbye to this exhibit and open something new, something where we can create new memories about the World's Fair, something where we can tell different stories about the World's Fair, because there's always more to discover and there's always more to know. So how are we going to do that? We have big plans for this gallery.
Probably get the X on that black card.
I actually don't see it on my screen here, Mike. So it's okay. It'll be all right. I apologize for that little black box. Technology gets away from us all sometimes, doesn't it? But you can see here, this is a sort of an overhead isometric view of what the new gallery will look like. Excuse me for just one moment. And this exhibit is going to be incredibly exciting. You can tell just from this overhead isometric view, we have a lot going on. I'll say first, right away, I'm going to head this question off. If anyone's worried about it, there's no neon green in the exhibit. That's not a color that we're using in the exhibit. That is for us. These are drawings so that when we start getting in graphic files and things like that of how things are actually going to look when we open the, as we get them in, we can plug in those graphic files into this drawing. That way we'll know for sure we're not going to miss any of our planned graphics or anything like that. It's bright green. You can't miss where the graphics are. So don't worry about the bright green. It's not going to be there. But you can tell there's artifacts in here. There's, huge images of the fair in here. There's interactives about the fair in here. There's a big thing in the middle of the space that I'm going to get into in more detail here in just a second. And some of you already know what it is. But this is an incredibly exciting time, an exciting new way to talk about the 1904 World's Fair. And how we're talking about it, really, a lot of it goes back to our tagline for the exhibit. Every piece of the fair that we talk about goes back to our tagline for the exhibit. And our tagline is relive the wonder, re-examine the complexity. Because when we talk to people about the World's Fair, and I'm sure you guys know this as you talk to people about the World's Fair, what you find is people tend to sit in one of two groups about the World's Fair. Either they want to talk about the wonder of the World's Fair, right? They want to talk about things like, the popularization of the ice cream cone, or the myths about, a ice cream cone and other famous foods from the fair. They want to talk about the amazing architecture of the fair. They want to talk about things like the Ferris wheel that were so popular and became icons of the fair and St. Louis in the aftermath of the 1904 World's Fair. They want to talk about those awe-inspiring moments when the sun goes down and the electric lights start to glow, right? And by the way, there's nothing wrong with talking about the wonder of the fair. It was a wondrous event for so many people that visited. It's easy to want to focus on that. And we need to focus on that because that's a real reaction that people had to the fair. So that's one camp. Then there's another camp of people that want to talk about the complexities of the World's Fair. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with wanting to talk about the complexities of the World's Fair too. It's an incredibly complex event that teaches us very sort of knotty and complicated things about the way the world was in 1904 and the things that we've had to try to move past as we've progressed as a society. Things like the Philippine reservation at the 1904 World's Fair, where over 1,000 people from the Philippines were brought to St. Louis and had their lives and bodies put on display for the 19 million plus people who visited the fair, and on display in ways that were done explicitly to increase U.S. support for the U.S. imperial project going on in the Philippines at the time. The U.S. owned the Philippines as a colony, held the Philippines as a colony at the time. So those exhibits were a lot about trying to increase support for that. That's a complex, knotty thing to talk about. People who wanted to focus on the complexity, they want to talk about things like the baby incubators, right? Which to a lot of us says, oh, that's this wondrous thing. It's science that's keeping young children, prematurely born children alive. But it's also something that was built, it was an attraction that was on the pike at the World's Fair. It was built as an amusement. And the people that built it put more attention and care into the experience of the people who were visiting that exhibit than they did the young babies who were in those incubators. Several of those babies died, and they didn't have to because of the poor care they received in the opening days of that exhibit. The guy who designed it ended up leaving during the World's Fair. He got fired and replaced with someone else who did a better job. That's a really complex story about something that to us on the surface sounds like a wondrous thing at the fair. And the central contention we're making with this new exhibit is that in order to really understand the World's Fair, you have to try to get your arms around both that wonder and that complexity at once. It's not, the World's Fair is not an event where something complex is happening over here and something wondrous is happening over here, and you can ignore one and talk about the other. Both things are happening at the same time in the same place. And that makes the fair endlessly fascinating. It tells us so many stories about the world in 1904 and how people experienced it. And that's the central contention we want to make here. Every part of our exhibit is touching on both the wonder and the complexity. What you see on screen right now is called a bubble plan of the exhibit. This is a top-down view of what the exhibit is going to look like. The exhibit is going to be in 2 galleries, right? It's going to be essentially in the same place where the World's Fair exhibit is now with a minor change. The minor change is this: that front room where the clock is, that is no longer going to be a part of the World's Fair exhibit. It's going to be an exhibit called You Are Here, exploring the history of the Missouri Historical Society. The World's Fair exhibit is going to start in the second gallery of that space, the gallery where the big carriage is now. That's the permanent part of the World's Fair gallery. And then some of you might have noticed in the back room of that gallery, there's 2 doors that are closed. Those doors are always closed, but there's a room back there. Currently, we use it for storage, but we're going to be opening those doors back up, and we're going to have a rotating gallery where we can tell new stories about the World's Fair every 2 years. So every 2 years, everything that's in that back gallery is going to change out so we can tell new stories. And we can that's a space allows us to be incredibly nimble. We have plans in the future for when the Olympics come back to the United States to do an Olympic photo show back there. We have all sorts of plans about the things we can do, the people we can partner with to make those shows as big and as grand as possible. But I want to start out walking you guys a little bit through Gallery 2, that big green gallery that was there, the gallery where the carriage is now. There's a couple of key parts to Gallery 2. There's going to be a scale model of the World's Fair in that room, and I'm going to get more into that scale model in just a moment. And then around the model, there's 3 essentially major sections that talk about the World's Fair. There's a section about the legacy of the fair, there's a section about the planning of the fair, and then there's a section about the experience of the fair. Each of those major sections is divided into subsections. I'm not good at titling things different, it's just subsections. And each subsection, though, starts with something, I think, a title that's very interesting, I think. Each subsection is titled the fair as something. So the fair as an amusement park, the fair as a stadium, the fair as a construction site. Because I find when I talk to people a lot about the World's Fair and they don't know about it, and I'm talking about the Pike or something, they might say, oh, the World's Fair is like an amusement park. Yeah, it kind of was, but it was so much more. So we think that those subsections, all titled the fair as, get at that very concept that's in our, the wonder and the complexity. The fair is a lot of different things all at the same time. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the scale model here. I'm going to walk through a lot of this, and I'm going to dive us deep into a few different subsections, not every section, because you guys have things to do today, I'm sure, besides listening to me. But I want to walk us through. I'm going to talking about the scale model. The scale model is denoted by these lovely arrows that I've so artfully inserted onto the bubble plan. If you guys walk away from this meeting, I need you to walk away from this meeting with two things today, okay? One, this new World's Fair exhibit is going to be really cool and really exciting, and I can't wait to see it. Two, Adam is a fantastic graphic designer. Those are the two things I need, okay? But the scale model, we have some inspiration for that scale model, right? We have things that we looked at other scale models that we wanted our scale model to do. The image on the left up there, you can see there's people standing around the scale model and there's touchscreen computers. That's how they're interacting with the scale model. We wanted that for ours. We didn't want the scale model to sit there and just have static things around it. We want people to be able, they can't touch it, but we want them to feel like they're interacting with the model in some way. And touchscreen computers are a great way to do that. The second thing you see up there are buildings that are lit up, buildings that, they're doing things, right? And we want that for our scale model. We want projections down the scale model that might be able to show people marching through the fairgrounds. We want to have it. I'm hoping to have it, and I've been told I have expensive tastes and like I need to calm down. But what I really want it to do is have the buildings so that they're on sort of a day-night cycle. So maybe 10 minutes out of every hour, the lights around the model dim a little bit, and the buildings themselves start to glow like they did in 1904. I think that would be an incredible effect for our visitors to show the power of the fair. Thank you. My idea got applause. That's so wonderful. So I have a couple mock-ups of what the scale model might look like. Before I show them to you, I do want to say the scale model is also going to include overhead projections. We have a few different options of what those overhead projections could look like. So the images I'm going to show you, don't get too married to one idea of what the overhead projections look like or the other. It could be one of those, it could be none of those, but I just want to let you know. Okay, so the scale model, this is the mock-up of what it could look like. The scale model is going to show every building, every path on the World's Fairgrounds. And there's going to be screens above it with quotes and photos and facts about the fair. And I'm really sorry to the people on here, but I need to step away for one moment and grab something for the folks in the room. So what I just sat down is a 3D printed to-scale model of Festival Hall. What we are going to have on the actual scale model is going to have a lot more detail than that. This is a kind of a skeleton print just to show the scale, and I've set it down on a map that shows essentially just Festival Hall and the Cascades. That's how big the model's going to be. It's going to essentially take up the same footprint as the carriage up there. It's going to be really big. It's going to be really cool. We think it's the kind of thing people are going to want to come back to again and again. You're going to want to come back every Christmas when you got family in town and show them the 1904 World's Fair model. That the overhead projections that I showed right there, this is one mock-up of what they could look like. Here's a few more. We could have a cutout that looks like, Festival Hall that we're projecting images onto. We could have something that looks like a magic mirror that we're projecting images onto. We could have, 4 screens around, something modeled after a badge from the World's Fair that we're projecting images onto. We have a lot of options for what it could be 2 really, really big sort of plain screens that you can see from each side of the gallery. We have a lot of options for what this could look like. We haven't quite made a decision on that, but we know those projections are going to be up there and that they're incredibly important. As I've mentioned already, I love that exhibit up there. One thing that I think that exhibit is missing is more photographs. I want more photographs of the 1904 World's Fair. I was just doing something yesterday where I had to go through photographs of the World's Fair, and it took me 3 hours longer than it should have because I was just looking at photos of the 1904 World's Fair and I got a little bit lost. We want to give people the opportunity to do that in the gallery. But the scale model I mentioned is going to have touch screens around it. Those touch screens are essentially going to allow people to take walking tours of the 1904 World's Fair. And we have 2 different ways they're going to be able to take those walking tours. We have one set of walking tours that we're developing that are curated walking tours that we're developing ourselves, right? So it could be an architecture tour of the fair, and you go through and you learn about some of the sites of incredible architecture that are at the fair. It could be a food tour of the fair. It could be an oddities tour of the fair, right? And you go through, and on the screen in front of you, it situates where the thing is on the model that we're talking about. It's got photographs of that thing and a little text explaining it, right? So we're thinking 3 or 4 tours like that. Then we have another 3 or 4 tours that we're developing that are essentially going to allow you to follow in the footsteps of someone who visited the 1904 World's Fair. We have a lot of incredible 1904 World's Fair diaries, as you guys know, and so we're pulling selections from them so our visitors can just follow in the footsteps of those people. The diary, the book that's on the screen right there is a World's Fair diary by Adele Quinette Phelps. It's our most recent diary acquisition here at the Missouri Historical Society. So we're pulling selections from that so our visitors, as they move forward, can follow in Adele Quinette Phelps' footsteps. So that's the scale model. It's incredibly exciting. And that on its own, I think, could be its own exhibit, but that is not all we're doing. We've got so much more in this show. So I'm going to walk you through the 3 major sections that are in the exhibit. The first one I'm going to talk about is Legacy of the Fair. Again, my wonderful graphic design comes into play with that very artful red circle with 3 arrows coming out of it. I worked really hard on that. But it shows legacies of the fair and then the 3 subsections of legacies of the fair. And that red square kind of next to it there, that's the door to the exhibit. So legacies of the fair is the first thing when you come in to your right. It's the first thing at the start of the exhibit because we wanted to put the legacies of the fair right up front. It's a question we get sometimes from people who are out of town or who are from a city maybe that hosted a World's Fair, that city doesn't celebrate it maybe as much as St. Louis does. They say, why do you guys care about the World's Fair so much? Well, it's because the World's Fair has an incredible legacy. And we don't want to hide that in the back. We want to talk about that right up front. So Legacies of the Fair is made up of 3 subsections, essentially. The fair as memory, which is a section where we talk about the way people make memories of the World's Fair today. It's going to feature the clock that's up there now as a way to talk about the World's Fair Society and the memories that you all are so important to creating in the night of the 1904 World's Fair. We're also going to have artwork and interviews with a local Filipino-American artist named Rhea Unson, whose grandfather was actually a waiter at the 1904 World's Fair, and her art talks a lot about what that legacy has meant for her identity and her family. So that's the fair's memory. Fair is a place you can still see, I'm going to get into. Then the fair's pop culture. That's a cheat. It's really Meet Me in St. Louis section, because we know that so many people today are introduced to the World's Fair for the first time through Meet Me in St. Louis. They watch that movie and they want to know more about the fair. So this is a section to talk about how important Meet Me in St. Louis is still in St. Louis at large. We have some really cool stuff in there, including every Christmas, a donor is going to allow us to borrow the red velvet dress that Judy Garland wears and Meet Me in St. Louis. We're going to be able to get that out every Christmas for folks to see. Yeah, it's pretty cool. But I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the fair as a place you can still see. I'm bad at titles, so this is exactly what it sounds like. It's stuff that you can still see or could still see from the fair for decades after the fair closed. We have a really cool artifact in this section. It's this bench on the bottom there. This is a terracotta bench that sat outside the British Pavilion at the 1904 World's Fair. It's the building up there on the top. And that red circle is, I've circled it, that's a bench that's identical to this one. Can't promise it's the same bench. There were several around the building, but it's identical to this one. It's one of several that sat out around the British Pavilion. After the fair was over, this building was supposed to be temporary, but Washington University liked it so much, they left it up and used it as their school of art for many, many years after the fair closed, until they built Bixby Hall. So this building helped to shape the minds of St. Louisans for decades after the fair closed. It was a way that the fair still impacted the lived, built environment in St. Louis for decades. But there's going to be all sorts of great photos and things like that in this section too. You know, photos of things like the bird cage in the art museum, the stuff people talk about all the time. We also want to have photos of things like this house over here. This was a house that was in the American Radiator Company display, meant to show off, you know, the wonders of radiators and how you should install radiators in your home. But after the fair was over, you can tell this building doesn't have a front on it. After the fair was over, someone bought that. They put a front on it and they moved it to Webster Groves. If you drive down Kenilworth Place in Webster Groves, you can still see that house today. So you can still see the fair all around you if you just know where to look. And we want to use this section to highlight that. And we have all sorts of great stuff that's going into this section of the exhibit. So that's just a little look at legacies of the fair. Now I'm going to move into the section about planning and building the fair, sort of the back corner back there, which is, again, exactly what it sounds like. It's a section about how the fair was dreamt of, planned, and built. There's 3 subsections to this. The fair's dream or vision, which talks about how, the planners of the fair came together, how they raised money, all that kind of stuff that went into, how they hired architects to design those buildings and sculptors to, make the statues. It's about all that kind of stuff. How is the fair dreamt of? At the fair's construction site, I'm going to get more into that one. And the fair as a delayed anniversary, because I'm sure as everyone in this room knows, 1904 World's Fair was supposed to happen in 1903. And you can still find all sorts of stuff like this lovely proclamation from the President of the United States that say 1903 on them. There's souvenirs that were printed with World's Fair 1903 on them. And they missed the deadline because, like a lot of large projects, there's delays. There's construction delays and planning delays and all sorts of delays that you can't anticipate. So it got delayed to 1904. And of course, you guys know about the Dedication Day parade that was held in 1903. So we want to use that section to highlight that parade as well and talk about, the size of it, the fact that the president was here, all these governors were here to dedicate their state houses. It was this really, really big deal in St. Louis at the time. Give me one moment. Okay, so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the subsection, the fair as a construction site. And this is a section, again, exactly what it sounds like. It talks about the way that the fair site was prepared, the way things were built, the people who built the things that were at the fair. We're going to have artifacts that show famed buildings at the fair under construction. We're going to talk about the way the fair changed Forest Park, moving the River to Pear underground, which we're intimately familiar here with at the Missouri History Museum, because if you walk down that hallway back there, there's an elevator. And when it rains enough, you can hear that river through the elevator shaft. I'm not sure if you're supposed to or not, but you can. So we're well aware that that river is still underground here. We want to hear stories about the people who were hired to build the fair, the kinds of works they did. We have artifacts like we have essentially a big sled that would have been pulled behind a horse that helped clear ground at the 1904 World's Fair, that according to the people who donated that artifact to us at the Missouri Historical Society, it was actually used to clear the ground at the fair site. And that's going to be in this exhibit. I think that's a tremendous artifact. I love stuff like that. But we also know, there's stuff in that exhibit, and I've mentioned it a couple times, there's stuff in that exhibit that works. It's great, right? That map that's on the ground up there, that's great. People love that map. That's what the model's sort of replacing. It's taking that map, moving it into a 3D space. Another thing that we know really works up there is the display of staff. How staff was made, the staff pieces. We talked a lot internally about what works, and that was a display that got particular notice from our staff, particularly our education staff. Kids come through that exhibit and they understand that display about staff. They understand what this temporary substance was and why it was used. So we want to not just copy it exactly, but take the parts of it that work, take the artifacts from it that we can, and retell that story in this gallery. So there's still going to be plenty of stuff in here about staff. There's going to be the touchable lion head still and some of those kinds of things. You're still going to get to see some of your favorite things in this exhibit. Okay, I do this every time. I tell myself, don't forget to add a slide, and I forgot to add the slide. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the section about the experience of the fair, which is those dark green circles on the bottom down there, that half of the gallery that is all about the experience of what it was like to go to and work at the fair in 1904. There are 6 different subsections to the fair experience. Oh, did I go too far? No, I didn't. Those sections are the fair's amusement park, the fair's laboratory, the fair's world tour, the fair's empire, the fair as arena, and the fair as workplace. There's a lot going on there, and I'm only going to dive into one, but I'm happy to answer questions about any one of them here in a few minutes. But the fair as laboratory is looking at the way the fair introduced people to new ideas in 1904. And there's so many new, like we can't possibly cover them all. There's just to give people a taste of all the different kinds of new ideas that were on display. There's things like, the DeForest wireless tower. Wireless telegraphy wasn't strictly new in 1904, but at the 1904 World's Fair, it was a lot of people's first first time having firsthand experience with wireless telegraphy, right? That tower is one of the tallest structures on the fair. There's a guy up there with a little transmitter who could send wireless telegraph messages, and there's little stations set up all around the fair that he can send messages to. And people would, even if they didn't have interest in wireless telegraphy, they would want to go up to the top of this and get a nice view of the fairgrounds. And then while they're up there, hey, why don't you go ahead and send a message without any wires connecting you in any way to somewhere else on the fair, or to our moving cart that's going around the fair with a receiver on it. And people would do that and then go to another part of the fairgrounds to see if their message made it. It was a way for them to see that wireless telegraphy worked, to gain a sort of trust of this new technology that's doing something that no one else had ever heard of before. There's new things like the Bissell sweeper, right? This thing that really revolutionized the way that people could clean their homes. And it was advertised for years and years and years after the World's Fair as a gold medal winning product at the 1904 World's Fair. That played in directly into how they tried to popularize this instrument for cleaning people's houses. We have things like food science at the fair, and there's a lot of food science, but some of you have heard me tell this story, but I love to tell it, so I'm just going to tell it again. We have a jar of preserved pears in our collection from the 1904 World's Fair. They're 119-year-old preserved pears, which really, and there was a lot of this kind of stuff at the fair. There was, a lot of agricultural science happening at the time that's increasing crop yields. There's new ways of storing foods to keep it longer. That was a big part of the fair. And so we have this jar of pears, and I desperately wanted to get out this jar of pears for the exhibit. And as we select artifacts for the show, and then we go through with our staff what's called an artifact tribunal, where we make sure it's safe for both the artifacts and our visitors that all these things come out and display. We had two problems with the jar of pears. One, and you can see this problem a little bit there. If you look at the bottom of the jar, you can see there's sort of a sludge at the bottom. Turns out, when a pear is like 120 years old, the skin of the pear is for decoration only. It doesn't actually do anything to protect the pear. So the second we move that jar, the pears rub together and they start to disintegrate into the bottom of the jar. So to move the jar is to destroy the artifact. That's the bigger thing. That's the biggest reason we can't use it. There's another reason though. So this jar of pears is off-gassing the substance the pears are preserved in. And our cases tend to be airtight. Well, as we were talking about this, what we figured out is that gas that it's off-gassing is potentially explosive. So if someone walked by at the wrong time and set off the wrong spark of static electricity with their shoe, they could set off a tiny explosion in the gallery. So I don't get to put the pears in the show. But our way around that is that we're creating a documentary that shows how our staff today is working behind the scenes to use the science of today to make sure that we're preserving the science of 120 years ago, that we're using science to make sure that this is going to be around for future generations. But there's more stories about the fair's laboratory we can get at. I already mentioned, the baby incubators. These are stories that are really sort of more about that complexity. The baby incubators is a great example of that. But there's more stories too. There were all sorts of, model classrooms at the fairgrounds showing off things like on this image on the left over here, that's an image of students from the school for the blind in Missouri in a model classroom, using new educational techniques to teach blind students. And in a lot of ways, that's wonderful, right? We're using new techniques to teach blind students, to reach blind students and give them an education. But not a lot of thought, once again, was given to the educational experience of those students who are in that classroom, as hundreds of people are coming through a day and asking a bunch of questions about what they're doing and how they're doing it, right? There's all sorts of stories about this in that section of the fair's laboratory that complicate that notion, right? Sometimes there's just not as much thought as we might put into stuff today about the experience of the people who are actually on display in some ways. So the last thing I want to talk about in Gallery 2, we have 4 spots, well, really 5 spots in this gallery, but 4 major ones that are set up as sort of infographic walls. right? And you can see the image on the top there shows it's looking like towards the entry to the exhibit, and there's those sort of wing walls there. On those walls are going to be infographics about the fair, facts and figures and stats about how many people visited, how many trees were planted, those kinds of things that, you know, sort of get at the scale and grandeur of the fair. That image at the bottom there is just an image I pulled of another infographic wall. I think this is something from ESPN, but it just shows that there's a little dimensionality to it. That's what we want for our infographic wall. We don't want to be just a flat thing sitting on the wall. We want to have some dimensionality, some life to it, right? To bring those numbers to life to people. And if it's something about, you know, the trees in the gallery, maybe it's a cutout of a tree that says, you know, this is how many trees are planted. It helps convey that information in a quick, memorable way. So that's a very quick look at Gallery 2. Now, again, my lovely arrows are pointing us to Gallery 3, the rotating gallery space. And I think this space is incredibly important. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first show that we have in there. But overall, I think the space is really important because A, it keeps the gallery fresh, right? We're always going to be able to tell new stories. As I mentioned, we have an Olympic photo show planned in there for when the Olympics come back to the US. We can also work with community groups to design shows back there. We can, you know, bring out highlights from our collection and bring them back there. We can theme things, artifacts that we have in our collection that maybe we don't think about as themed sometimes, but we can theme them up in interesting ways back there. And not only does this bring in new stories and new artifacts to this exhibit, but I contend it also keeps everything that's permanent in Gallery 2 incredibly fresh. So this first show back there is all about the different countries that came to St. Louis, right? It's called The World in St. Louis. And so you go through Gallery 2, and then you go into Gallery 3, you learn about the different nations that were in St. Louis. And then there's only one way in and out of this gallery. You need to walk back through the permanent part of the gallery to exit. So I know if that was me, I'd go through that, seeing all the stuff about all these different nations that came to St. Louis. And then as I'm walking back through, I'd be looking for that stuff in the gallery. If it was an Olympic show back there, I'd be coming through that gallery looking for things about the Olympics. I'd go to the model and look for stuff about the Olympics. It helps keep this stuff that's supposed to be permanent a little bit fresher, a little bit, you know, it makes it feel new again every couple of years. But our first show back there is called The World in St. Louis. There's going to be a big map of the world from 1904 on the back wall back there with all the countries that had a presence at the World's Fair highlighted on that map. And then the map is going to be surrounded with infographic facts about things that those countries brought here, right? And this is a map of the world from 1904. We're going to probably clean it up so there's not so much mess on it for people, so it's a little bit more legible. But I think that's going to be an incredibly compelling thing that you can see on a map of the world, all these different places that were represented in a fairly small part of the city. And then we're also going to have a case of different artifacts. You know, there's going to be artifacts in the main gallery that are from, you know, different places around the world, but we have so many more in our collection than are able to go out in the permanent gallery. So we have a case of artifacts back there that talk about all the different nations that came to St. Louis. You know, we have a chair from Ireland, and statues from Italy, and ivory wood, inlaid wood from China. You know, we have all sorts of stuff in that case to really show off, you know, all the different places around the world that were here in 1904. And then finally, in this backspace, we have three sort of smaller cases. We have one case that's going to be a case of souvenirs. This is a rotating case too. You know, there's a lot of souvenirs from the 1904 World's Fair, and we have a share of them in the main gallery, but again, just not enough that we can get them all out at once. So we have a case back there. We can show off different parts of our souvenir collection. Our first round back there is going to be ceramics that show off the major palaces of the fair. And I don't need to tell this group, that's not just cups and saucers. It's also ceramic hats and ceramic boots and ceramic I don't know what's, right? Like, I don't know why they were making all these things out of ceramics, but they did. And so we're going to be able to show those off in that case. And then in a few years, maybe we switch it out. Maybe it's all blue souvenirs from the fair. Maybe it's all spoons from the World's Fair. We're still having those discussions, but we're going to be able to change that out and highlight different parts of our collection in that. We're also going to have a case back there that's just of ruby glass. We know that that's one of the most popular souvenirs from the fair. And what I think is really, really neat about the way we're displaying it, it's all going to be in one case, which can look powerful enough on its own, a case full of ruby glass, right? But every piece we're getting out is also etched in some way. It's with a dedication to someone. And to me, that's such an important thing to remind myself of when I think of the 1904 World's Fair. Because when I go on vacation and I visit somewhere, I see something that reminds me of my niece or my uncle or my mother or whoever, and maybe I buy a little souvenir, right? People at the 1904 World's Fair were doing that with ruby glass. Every piece of this is etched with to Mom, to Bob, whatever. It's a really powerful reminder of the connections we still have to the way that people visited the 1904 World's Fair. And then we're also going to have a nice salon wall in that back room where the John Ross Key paintings will be out with a few benches around it. You know, there's a lot going on in this gallery, as I'm sure you can tell. It's all very exciting. We want to give people an opportunity to rest, take in some nice views, take in some nice artwork of the fair, and just have a space to reflect. So we're going to provide that in the gallery. So that is my very quick walkthrough of the plans we have for this new gallery. I hope you can tell that I'm incredibly excited about this exhibit. I hope you are too. And I'll take any questions or anything that anybody has. Can't promise to have all the answers. Also, if you have questions you think of later or just questions that you're not necessarily comfortable sharing with a crowd of people, I do have my email address up there on the screen. Please feel free to send me an email. Yes.
I have
Sure.
I was a docent in 2004 for a couple of years at the it was great fun.
Good.
And I'm glad the gallery, the upstairs that at the school. My grandparents, I have relatives that came to work on the World's Fair construction, and they had come here. My grandparents would have never had. Therefore, I don't know.
Wow.
And finally, on Saturdays, I work at the Storage Camera Store
Mhm.
in Rockville. They had a store downtown. They've been in business, they had a store downtown, but when the fair came, they opened a satellite store in Bolivar to cater to all the photographers.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and that's, I mean, you know, the story about Schiller's there, it really highlights the way that photography is so important to the way people experience the World's Fair and the way we remember it today. So, no, I'm really glad you shared all of that. Thank you so much. Yeah, over here.
I love the idea of photographs and pictures and maps and everything. But I've found in museums lately that often there aren't as many artifacts often. And what happens is that is what I think the people like the most
Sure.
about the current exhibit. How many, compared to 250 that are there now, how many think will be in the permanent exhibit?
There's over 200 artifacts going into the new exhibit. I understand the concern, but yeah, we have a lot of really, we have some stuff that's out that's old favorites. We also have stuff that we have in our collections that we've gotten a sense that hasn't been able to come out before. I mentioned that World's Fair sled. I think that's really cool. We have a vase that's about this tall from Japan that's going to come out. I think that's an incredible artifact. We have David R. Francis's desk, the desk he sat at as he planned the 1904 World's Fair. That's going to be out in this exhibit. Like, we have some really, really incredible artifacts that are coming up.
A little point, I appraised the desk
Oh yeah,
for the museum to purchase.
that's incredible. Well, thank you for doing that. Yes.
No, but it's just the other talk about all that stuff. But this is a specific part of the vision statement of the district museum, not only for the St. Louis, but also specifically the 1904 World's Fair.
Well, I'm looking to Sam.
Well, this is specifically mentioned in the mission statement. The fact that in the presence of the past 20 years in that gallery, it's going to be a presence for the next many years in the new gallery, the central focus.
And I think for us too, just to build on that a little bit, you know, I think for us too, we have a real, you know, this is a history museum. We have a real recognition that the building we're in wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the 1904 World's Fair too. So, you know, we want to make sure that we always have a presence for the 1904 World's Fair in our museum. So as we were talking about, you know, our vision for the 2020s and redoing all those major galleries, like Sam said, you know, there was never a moment where we really entertained the idea that we shouldn't have a World's Fair gallery. That's always been a part of those plans. Mike has something.
3 years ago, I think woman who's still here is your operations person, Karen Gary, told me in response to the same question that it's not in quote the mission statement, which gets changed every 10 or 20 years. I don't know if the History Museum has a charter that dates way, way back. But there was general agreement that, yes, we are committed to preserving World's Fair memory, et cetera, somewhere, somehow, continuous. Now, one of the first questions I asked was, if you're gonna get rid of that exhibit, you got World's Fair stuff coming back, okay, are you gonna put a temporary World's Fair exhibit somewhere? Because I've heard, and some of you probably know, that 20 or 30 years ago, there was nothing more than one case of World's Fair souvenirs. Even though back over in the basement of the LSD, there was rooms and rooms full of stuff. It wasn't really promotable until I think it was somewhere in the 80s when that exhibit with the elevator walking around upstairs.
It's before my time.
And so I asked the question during this intermission between the current exhibit and the new one, will there be a World's Fair exhibit? And the answer I got back from different managers was, well, not really, but we will have programs and et cetera to keep that memory alive during that. And you'll forgive us while we build something new and exciting. And if Adam hasn't gotten you excited, I'm not sure what. It's listening to, you know, everything going on, and I'm like, boy, I can't wait. I'm sure he can't wait.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's gonna be a lot of work to get us there, but you know, we are dedicated to taking it on. I think everybody here is excited to take on that work to bring these stories to life for you. Yeah.
Yes, could you explain again what for works?
So yeah, so the Clockworks, they are going to be back in the new exhibit. I mentioned we have a section called The Fair as Memory in the show. And The Fair as Memory is really a little subsection, like I said, about the different ways that people are still creating memories of the World's Fair today, even though the World's Fair isn't in living memory for anybody in St. Louis. And, you know, we think that the Clockworks are a really great example of the way that the World's Fair Society works to keep the memory of the World's Fair alive. And we know that there was certainly interest from the World's Fair Society in keeping the Clockworks in the exhibit. And so that seemed like a really natural fit to us. And so
That was my second question.
it certainly was. And so, you know, those Clockworks are going to be back in there to help us tell the story of the World's Fair Society and why the World's Fair Society is such an important part of the legacy of the World's Fair. Oh yeah, no, it's
Digging and finding the clock.
and I believe we're bringing somebody in. I forget the gentleman's name. Mike knows it. Dave Warner to you know clean everything back up and get it all back in you know pristine working order. It's doing great, but you know it's been 20 years since we've had a real look at it. So you know we're just going to take some time, make sure everything's okay. Gentleman in the back.
Do you have any idea how many World's Fair
Do we have any idea? We do have an idea of how many World's Fair artifacts we have. I do not know that number off the top of my head. I'm not a curator. They don't let me touch anything because I'll just break it instantly. So I don't know that number off the top of my head, but certainly our curatorial staff knows that number. We have a lot. Like this is what we're getting out is a very small percentage of what we have. So yes, back here.
In 1995, the large exhibit was there in the same gallery. And the History Museum came to the World's Fair Society and asked for volunteer docents. And I was there. They asked me, I stayed for 19 years.
Sure.
The gallery was very nice. Let me ask you, in preparation for your talk today, did you do any research with the attendance figures of that exhibit?
I did not.
If they were to take
Yeah, and I did not look into that. I apologize. You know, I can certainly look into it. I don't know where those records live. I essentially contacted a person who I thought had those kinds of records, and then she had to contact like 3 other people to find the records for me. So it was a step for me to get there just because that's not my area. But I can certainly look into whether we have those figures and try to get them to Mike to pass along to.
On that topic, I heard maybe anecdotally But in the 1980s, when that prior exhibit opened, that lasted up until 2003 or 4, okay, you know, that lasted up until it was taken down. When they opened it up, I think the World's Fair Society had a tent out front or something like that. And there was a line stretching out to Linville and down Linville a ways to get into that, in to see that. And for quite a while, like you said, with the numbers up there, you know, people couldn't they'd get in line to go see.
Oh, yeah. And we're, you know, I think we're all pretty confident that we're going to see that same kind of excitement for this new exhibit too, certainly. Yes.
People, employees are involved in putting this project together.
You know, I have a difficult time putting a number on that, if only because, you know, I think every employee at this museum, whether they work on this project directly or not, has a, you know, some skin in the game here. They have a role in this exhibit, whether it's doing something that I don't have the time to do because I'm researching something for World's Fair, whether it's, you know, bring people into the new exhibit to talk to them about the World's Fair, to get them excited to come back to this exhibit, whether it's making sure our facilities are safe and clean for everyone. Every employee in this museum has a hand in this exhibit. So I really think of it as a full team effort. And I don't really take a head count on how many people show up to my meetings or anything like that. So yeah, you know, I think every employee here has an investment in this exhibit being the best that it can be, and being the best that it can be for everyone in St. Louis. Yeah.
One of the things that has happened over the last 10 years or so, and the History Museum got on board too, was with their digitized photos. Of course, the public library is big time into that with almost 7,000 World's Fair pictures. Is the ability of people at home to go see those pictures and zoom in to see high resolution details. Will there be some screens or whatever set up with maybe 10 or 20 or 30 photos that, you know, people can go in and zoom in and see those guys working on the Ferris wheel way up there, or how small the people are compared to palaces?
You know, right now, I don't think we have any pinch and zoom screens in the gallery. Those were in there at one point, then we had some budget issues, and I think those went away. What I will say is that, you know, we're launching a campaign, not just to redo our core galleries and stuff, but to really increase our online holdings, the availability of our online holdings, the photos that we have online. So certainly a part of this exhibit, and all that stuff's connected, right? So a part of this exhibit is going to be driving people to the website to be able to use our cross-collection search to access those photos and interact with them for themselves. And there'll be all sorts of information in there about exactly what the title of the photo is, what the number of the photo is. So it'll be easily findable for you on our website. When you want to take that on?
My suggestion would be, if things aren't all set in contract, in concrete, you know, for every screen, et cetera, would be to consider at least one, if not a couple of screens that, like when you go into today, there's some screens and you can touch and you can see things. The menu and the architecture of that is okay. Was designed many years ago.
Yes.
But those zoomable pictures, I can tell you personally, and I think most people have seen some of the presentations I've done or other people, that when you zoom in and I say, okay, here's the Ferris wheel, 3/4 done. Can you see the workers on it? I zoom in. Can you see the workers? And you, oh, I see 1 or 2 people.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, there's 8 or 10 or 15 people up there. And it gives it a sense of scale. And when you zoom back out, you go, my gosh, how huge this.
Well, and I think that is part of the, you know, that was certainly part of you know, you mentioned it as an exhibit I worked on in the past. I think that was part of Panoramas of the City. Part of what made that exhibit so successful was having the photos shown at such a scale. You know, the example I always use for anyone who remembers that show. We had a panorama of Charles Lindbergh speaking at the base of Art Hill after he took his historic flight in 1927. And at the scale that photo was blown up to, and you couldn't see it at its normal scale, but the scale it was blown up to, you could see people sitting on the roof of the art museum to hear him speak. I don't know how they got up there. And so, you know, I really think our projection screens, you know, I think the pinch and zoom is certainly something that we're going to keep talking about. But I think even just the projection screens that are going to be above the model are going to be at such a scale that a lot of those details are going to be visible above the model as those photos scroll through. Yes.
Since the World's Fair was ready to celebrate the centennial celebration of the Louisiana Purchase, how much of the new exhibit will focus on the Louisiana Purchase, Lucid Park, etc.?
Not that much, honestly. You know, it's going to get a mention, a big mention, because that's, as you mentioned, why it was there. But you know, the focus that we want to have is on the fair itself. So you know, we want to give that kind of background. We also want to give a little bit of background on what were World's Fairs, where were other World's Fairs, why were these such big deals? Because it is something that so many people today have no firsthand experience of. So we want to make sure we're answering those kinds of questions in the gallery somewhere, but it's certainly not going to be the major focus. Any other questions? Oh, thank you so much. And as I mentioned, if anybody has any questions for me, there's my email on the screen. We also have Sam and Emily and Lindsay and Charles back there. Be sure to thank them for all the work they did on this program today and on this exhibit on your way out. Thank you guys so much.
Wow. That's about all I have to say. I'm excited. You got me excited, but don't go too far.
All right.
Adam gave an earlier version of this a little over a year ago to us on Zoom, sitting at home.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it was really neat and fun there. And this is a second presentation to the World's Fair Society. So I want him to draw a name for an attendance prize, like I said, the At the Fair Laura Merritt Journal. I don't know if you've read it or not.
I have not, but no one's going to get mad at me if I don't draw their name, right? Everybody's okay? All right, well then I'll do it. Okay.
Yeah, we may have to go through 2 or 3 names. You never know. Because there's 2 months worth.
All right. We've got Linda de Villar. Am I pronouncing that right?
Linda is probably at work out at Boeing.
Okay. Sorry, Linda, if you're watching this. Oh, I can't read that. Is that
Tom Vitale.
all right?
Yes. Well, it only took two names, but don't go too far. I do have one last question for you. The 3D imagery, and I had to step out because I had to take a phone call about a cat that's at the vet and stuff. That's obviously a stylized festival hall without any detail and stuff on it. And to the scale that the model is going to be at?
Yes.
Wow.
But as I mentioned, you know, the one that'll be in there will have a lot more detail on this. This is just like a skeleton print, just so we can see what that scale is. Even on this little side here, it's probably hard to see for a lot of you. There's this little bar. That's the scale that people would be.
Yes. And that's the kind of thing I was referring to on the pictures, that on a picture like this, and this isn't enough resolution to be able to see if there's any people walking around over there. Not sure if that's maybe some people down here or not.
Well, there's some, you can tell with this gentleman here, there's some ghosting on people too, so the further they would.
But they're very close. The scale when they get up here to the walkway and stuff is just incredible. And when I do presentations, that's one of the things I leave people with is, wow, I can't believe it was that big. One more question back there.
Probably, yes. I mean, there's going to be, you know, there's a lot of moving parts to it. Frankly, we're working with a design firm and a fabrication firm to build those things. But once again, that is just something that is like so far beyond, like they're like, is it okay for you X or Y? I'm like, is it going to look like this? Then fine. Like, you know, that's, I don't care. You know, I can't really answer the questions of, you know, what it's going to be made out of, or what's 3D printed versus hand carved. I think those are questions that are a little bit outside of my comfort zone to answer. So, sorry.
The reason I wanted to kind of ask that question about Festival Hall is some of us remember in the prior exhibit, there was about a 3 foot by 3 foot little model. And I don't know if that's been rediscovered down in the
We
basement.
have that in the flash scene.
And it had Festival Hall and I think the colonnade along the top of Art Hill, but not the pavilions or something like
Yeah, we
that.
did have that.
Okay, and it was about not even half that size, maybe about a third that size. And I think we've always thought how neat it was. We had a member who back in the 90s before he passed, who made a model of Festival Hall out of foam back. Foam back is that 1/4 inch thick foam that they put behind pictures. When they put pictures in a frame. And that Festival Hall picture, Yvonne, I know you remember it well. He put it up about 2 or 3 times, once here, once at the zoo. I think that whole thing stood a good 4 feet high. He'd put it on a table and it would be high. Using foam back, obviously that's flat surface, but he did a lot of little pieces to make the columns and stuff. And that was neat to see. There's not too many pictures of that around, unfortunately. But I just want to say I'm so excited. I'm sad to see this go, but I understand the need to do it that way and, et cetera. Anything else for Adam before I finish up here? Oh, yes.
If we need to store any of that stuff anywhere.
Mr. Collector.
Certainly, I don't work in a volunteer office, so I can't answer that question. But I would imagine there's gonna be some need for some volunteers that, and we're gonna be getting our own volunteers up to speed. So if you have interest in that, certainly, contact our volunteer office out there and they can get you set.
I believe, in fact, I asked that same question yesterday. And I was given a card by Michelle at the desk. And the card I got, I don't know if I have it with me or not. Oh, I do, I think. No, I don't. Wrong pocket. I think it was Kat somebody
Yes.
in charge of the docents. I think back in 2004, the History Museum did not have a large staff of docents. And members of the society, going back to the 86 exhibit too, raised their hands and served as docents to stand around and answer questions because our passionate hobbies is most likely the fair. And we can answer most questions and say, go look at this, or that's the real neat thing to see, et cetera. And I'm going to get in touch with her because I have done a little bit of work with some of the docents to provide them a talker, a 2 or 3 page thing about the fair to make sure all the numbers are right, et cetera. Because after 20 years, I think I've forgotten about 20% of the numbers and I have to refresh my memory sometimes.
I understand that.
And I will volunteer, call her to see if we could provide some augmentation, if there are some people that are interested in that. And if they are willing to, let us come in and talk about the fair and just hang out in the exhibit, which we kind of did yesterday and ended up talking with some people about the map and, the panorama and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the panorama is not part of the new exhibit. So if the big 9-foot one that you can buy the smaller scale of that, we have and the History Museum is selling also. But that big 9-foot wide one from, what's his name? Yes, is not part of the new exhibit. So make sure in the next 30 days or, 5 or 6 weeks, you take one more good look around and take some last pictures because some of the things you're not going to be able to see for a while more. Okay, moving on. Adam, I just want to thank you so much. That was
Yeah, I was gonna get out of here.
oh.
I don't want to take any.
Want to cover a quick summary of our upcoming meetings. As was mentioned earlier tonight, at the Schlafly Bottle Works, and I'm sure nobody has ever been there before to imbibe in some beer and a sandwich or something, from 7 to 9 p.m., the World's Fair, FARE, and Heritage Festival organization, who runs the Labor Day show that we often set up at for 2 or 3 days, has a fundraising event to support their upcoming activities. They're having a food and fun Trivingo or Tri-Vingo, or however you want to pronounce it, evening, alternating rounds of trivia and bingo. You can eat dinner, enjoy a beer, and win prizes at the Schlafly Bottle Works from 7 to 9 p.m., and that's on Southwest Avenue in Maplewood. Another program that the History Museum is having closer to the closing on March 28th here at the History Museum, and I'm not sure if it's in this room or in the theater. History Museum is hosting a presentation by some scholars titled "Meet Me Outside the Fair." This was in your little news bulletin about meetings that you get if you're getting the emails. This program will discuss the involvement and influence of the St. Louis African American community at the 1904 World's Fair. And then in April, on Sunday, April 30th, 1:30, right here in this room, mark it on your calendars, Charles Kaler, where'd he go? Charter member, first vice president of the World's Fair Society, has dusted off his old Polaroid 3D slides and gotten 4 slide projectors to cooperate again, carousel slide projectors, because he has a little primitive early controller for them that plays music and shows 2 slides 3D on a special screen. Can't use this screen, it's a smaller screen, but what's the word for it?
Lenticular.
Lenticular. It's a silvered screen so that it shows the sharp imagery that's in those real photographs. And when you put your special 3D glasses on, it separates those two for your eyes. And I've told many of you this, the first time I was sitting there kind of in the front row, and we'll have this screen set up about here, I felt like I could reach out and grab a couple of those water drops from a fountain. You know, it was that good of a 3D. So we'll have some light refreshments in this room, and that's going to be April 30th, Sunday at 1:30 right here. And when this place closes that day, that's your last chance to go see the current exhibit. A couple other meetings in May. Saturday, May 20th, we'll have our annual picnic at Kirkwood Park at the Campbell Pavilion. More to follow on that. Monday, June 19th, we will have a meeting I just scheduled at Booter Library. Carol Sheldon of the Missouri Storytellers is going to tell about the African American experience on July 17th, 1904. And then Tuesday, July 18th, somebody volunteered or signed me up or whatever to do a construction at the fair and park restoration program. I've got a lot of the pieces, and Doug's going to help me pull it together over the next few months, and that'll be in July. So I'm going to be, watching with interest the construction of the fair, because I'll take just one more minute here. That I always like leaving people with the impression of the magnitude and enormity of the fair. And that's number one, that they did so much in 2.5 years, all the countries of the world, all the states that brought exhibits. They built the buildings that are bigger than 4 to 6 or 7 Macy's put together in acreage. That's the number one wow thing. Number two is the Ferris wheel. And go back to 1893 and 4, the fact that it was built and put together and worked the first time, something that big, and seeing it put back together. We all played with Tinker Toys or erector sets when we were kids, and you'd lose pieces and stuff like that. I think there was over 100,000 pieces and parts that they took from Chicago down here, and they got them all back together the right way. The third thing that impresses me that I've really come to appreciate in this last year or two, the more I learn about it, was, and I'm so glad you're going to do a section on this, Adam, is the planning that went into it. Because in the early 1901, they had sold the stock for $5 million. They were promised $5 million from Missouri, but they were going to get a $5 million loan from the government. And that didn't get approved until, I think, July or August 1901, because the LPE organizing committee at the time said, we got to have $15 million before we really get this thing going. And the government didn't approve the loan until late, middle or late 1901. Okay, we've got that money. So where are we going to have the fair? There was 6 locations, and I'll be covering that in that presentation. Of course, Forest Park, the western half of Forest Park was obvious. As long as they built a permanent art museum, and then cleared the fairgrounds afterwards. And that was the obvious location, but there were actually two different layouts that were considered. The one we know and an earlier one. And so once that layout got determined, boom, we got to bury that pesky river and make sure, you know, it's kind of swampy right now. Oh, we need water to all the buildings. We need sewage drainage from all the buildings for toilets and stuff. Oh, we need fire hydrants all over the place. We need high pressure water to pump water just in case something catches fire. And then we can start laying the foundations after we get all that. Oh, there's a forest in the way, part of it. We got to cut a bunch of trees down, get the stumps out of there, blow them up and get them out of the, you know, all that was going on at such a pace in early 1902. And the planning to get all that done so that by the middle of '02, the foundations were getting done, to me is an accomplishment right up there with building, because they knew how to build things. But the planning that went into it is just, you know, something I've really begun to appreciate. So, you know, if you take that and, you know, think about it on yourself as you look at the current exhibit, the new exhibit, et cetera, you know, I think you'll begin to appreciate that. Any other questions about meetings, World's Fair events, stuff like that?